Shockwaves through LGBTQ South Florida Little Moscow over Ukraine's invasion. Dramatic comparisons are being made with the toxic masculinity of Russia's Vladimir Putin and the courage shown this weekend by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Putin, who is famously anti-LGBTQ, has all but extinguished a gay presence in Russia. Queer News Tonight reported last week that the U.S. wrote a report to the UN that a kill list had been created against LGBTQ in Ukraine by the Russian invasion forces, and this fact created international condemnation. Now that invasion has begun, there is a secondary effect here in South Florida, as one of the largest Russian communities in America, called Little Moscow, exists, and a substantial number of LGBTQ are among this Russian-speaking community. An estimated 200,000 speak Russian, coming from Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and live in South Florida, with between 14 to 20,000 LGBTQ Russians living here. The affluent communities of Sunny Isles and Aventura are ground zero for the South Florida Russian community, and there are reports on the U.S. and European sanctions in banking, real estate, and other restrictions now affecting the community. Leaders in the LGBTQ+ community in Ukraine have defiantly said they will not be intimidated, despite fears for their safety and the future of Ukraine. In response to the violence, Outright Action International has started to accept financial donations to help queer people direly in need of support during the invasion. The organization said that funding will be given to the LGBTQ+ organizations in Ukraine that are preparing to receive queer people in search of shelter, safety, and security. Outright said, quote, "Already people are leaving Ukraine's capital, Kiev, and the eastern part of the country for, at the moment, safer rural areas and the western parts of the country, while neighboring EU countries are providing shelters for an influx of displaced people," end quote. Lenny Empson, director of Kiev's Pride, urged people to provide international political support. Empson said, quote, "My task as an LGBTQI activist is to stay with my community and to help them to stay calm, to keep going and keep fighting. Some people are panicking and some people are anxious. We cannot avoid it, but it's how we manage this panic, how we manage this anxiety. This is what is important in my task as director of the biggest pride organization in Ukraine," end quote. Since the first days of the invasion, even with the large South Florida LGBTQ community and the large Russian-speaking LGBTQ community, to date, there have been no organized protests or other programs of support.
The silence is deafening.
Yeah.
People under 40 in Russia, or the Soviet Union, which included Ukraine at the time, Belarus, all those Eastern European countries, it's only been, they have no recollection of how terrible it was. And while Russia is not a communist country anymore, they're authoritarian capitalism. And you have to keep the history alive. And I saw an interesting quote, because the financial impact is having a much bigger impact on Russia right now than the Ukrainian armed forces. And it was very telling. One of the Russian spokespeople for the government said, "We have been preparing for sanctions for a long time." Well, why are you preparing for sanctions unless you are premeditatedly knowing how you're going to make the dominoes fall across Europe? This has been well thought out. He's been in power for 2 decades, and I can't believe he just came up with this in the last year and a half.
Mm-hmm. Are you all surprised? One of the contexts of this story is what a gigantic Russian speaking community exists here in South Florida. And the percentage, therefore, of LGBT. Does that surprise you of how many Russians are here in South Florida?
I used to get my lashes done in that area, and there are a lot of Russians in that area. I'm not sure, I'm surprised that they don't have a protest or something like this going on. I don't want to speak out of term. I don't know if maybe they have expired visas or they have some kind of immigration issues, and maybe that's why they're not protesting, because the amount of Russians that are in that area, I mean, like, it's more of them than there are of anybody else. Mm-hmm. That's like their little Moscow is for real.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like I learned something. I was not aware that there was actually an LGBTQ Russian community within that community. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Have you actually even met? Okay, wow.
I've seen the Red Star.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. In all seriousness, though, I used to work with a producer. She was a fabulous producer and editor, and she emigrated when she was very young in the 80s from St. Petersburg, Russia. And she said her mother worked in a particular bureau and met Vladimir Putin when he was just a youngling starting out back in the early 80s, and said she could tell even then he was going to be powerful and he was going to be trouble.
You know, this is an LGBT story, in my opinion, for a different reason. We're here in South Florida. We have a similar situation of protest over, historically, Vladimir Putin, Fidel Castro, Russia and Cuba. Very similar kinds of streams. If this was going on and Cuba invaded Puerto Rico, well, not a good example, but they invaded Nicaragua or whatever, the condemnation that would be happening here in South Florida would be overwhelming. We couldn't turn the television off. It would be so loud. Where is everyone in South Florida, especially the LGBTQ community, about what's going on in Ukraine and Russia? Where are we? Why are we not talking about it?
I don't know.
It's a complicated issue. People don't really like to think much beyond reading a headline or something like that, because you have to read a lot. Like that comment I found from the Russian minister. That was like deep into like the third article I had read today before I found it. I mean, I think it's just hard to educate yourself unless you want to take time.
And maybe people are overwhelmed with what's happening at home, what's happening here in our own state.
Because of Tallahassee.
Right, so I mean, maybe you just have some people having to pick.
You know, it's disappointing to me because the word liberty exists in English, and liberty and libertad, I think, in Spanish, and liberty exists in the Russian language. I don't understand why it's not as loud and powerful in the Russian language as it is in our South Florida Spanish language. One other thing that I want to say that I think is interesting going on, I'm posting and commenting almost every single time I stand with Zelensky or I stand with Ukraine. At least it's my contribution in terms of voicing up. You have Putin and then you have Zelensky. You play the game, who wore it best? Who wore Vladimir best? Vladimir Putin, Vladimir Zelensky. Let me tell you, Mr. Putin, Zelensky is wearing it way, way better than you are.
Absolutely.
I have learned over the last couple of days he's the voice of the Paddington Bear in the movie.
He's a comedian?
He's a comedian. He's an actor.
No.
Right?
He wishes.
He
No, he's
wishes.
the voice of Pudding Head Bear.
Hashtag boycott Paddington.
Right. Who wore it best? Vladimir Zelensky was the winner of Ukraine's Dancing with the Stars. And this guy is standing in front of the presidential assembly hall saying the Russian misinformation of we're surrendering, drop your arms. No, I'm not. I'm standing right here in front of the National Assembly. I'm still here and I'm not going anywhere. And, he found a fan, and I know millions and millions of fans, when our State Department, very nice gesture, said, we really need to get you out of Russia. And he goes, I need bullets, not a ride. Who's wearing it better, Putin?
Yeah.
It's called President Zelensky. Just saying.
LGBTQ plus news is vital for our community and for the broader world as a whole. We have enough enemies at Fox News. Tucker, Sean, and Laura are loud. We need passionate allies. Happening Out Television Network, Queer News Tonight, and It's Happening Out are literally out of the closet and into the headlines. Our community needs your support. Like this broadcast and subscribe now to ensure the growth of the entire LGBTQ